10 minutes beside Blackmere, Lady Rosamund Vale whispered, her smile bright enough to pass for kindness from across the ballroom. Unless, Miss Bellamy, you are frightened. Eliza Bellamy heard the laughter before anyone bothered to hide it. It traveled softly through the glittering assembly at Wycliffe Hall, concealed behind ivory fans and crystal glasses, elegant enough to escape accusation and cruel enough to accomplish its purpose. Beyond the tall windows, winter darkness lay across the Finger Lakes, and moonlight silvered the frozen gardens while hundreds of candles turned the ballroom gold. Eliza stood among silk gowns, black evening coats, and inherited fortunes in a dress of midnight blue that had once belonged to her mother. She had altered it herself by candlelight at Bellamy Orchard House, carefully hiding worn seams beneath dark ribbon. Until tonight she had believed no one would notice. She had been wrong. Surely you aren't serious, Rosamund, Lady Florence Mercer murmured, though delight betrayed her voice. Rosamund's gaze traveled toward the far end of the ballroom. There, separated from the nearest guests by an almost unnatural circle of empty floor, sat Duke Gideon Harrow of Blackmere. He wore black, without decoration except for a silver watch chain disappearing beneath his waistcoat. He had spoken to almost no one since arriving. At 38, Gideon possessed enough wealth to make ambitious families seek him and a reputation severe enough to make them regret succeeding. People lowered their voices when he passed. Mothers warned daughters not to stare. Men who boasted freely elsewhere became strangely careful in his presence. And beside him stood an empty chair. Rosamund looked back at Eliza. 10 minutes. Another ripple of laughter followed. Eliza felt heat rise beneath her collar, but she refused to lower her eyes. She understood the game perfectly. They did not expect her to entertain the Duke. They expected him to dismiss her. Perhaps he would rise without acknowledging her. Perhaps he would summon a servant to remove the chair. Whatever happened, Rosamund would have her amusement, and by morning half the county would know how desperately poor Eliza Bellamy had presumed upon the most feared man in the room. Very well, Eliza said. Rosamund blinked. What? You proposed 10 minutes. Eliza placed her untouched glass on a passing tray. I would hate to disappoint you. The laughter vanished. That was the trouble with accepting cruelty calmly. It forced cruel people to watch what they had begun. Eliza crossed the ballroom. Every step seemed louder than the orchestra. She could feel eyes following the hem of her old blue gown across the polished floor. 20 feet. 15. 10. Gideon Harrow remained motionless, one hand resting against the arm of his chair, his profile hard beneath the candlelight. 5 feet. Eliza nearly stopped. Not because she feared him, she told herself, but because dignity sometimes required knowing when pride had carried one far enough. Then she remembered Rosamund's smile. Eliza reached the empty chair. Your Grace. Gideon gave no indication that he had heard. She sat. Somewhere behind her, a fan snapped shut. Eliza folded her gloved hands in her lap and stared toward the dancers. 1 minute, she thought. Then another. She would endure 10. She had endured creditors walking through her father's library and valuing his books. She had endured neighbors becoming strangers when the Bellamy fortune disappeared. She could survive laughter. Yet something changed beside her. Gideon's fingers became still. Slowly, the Duke turned his head. Eliza felt his gaze before she met it. His eyes were dark gray, colder at first glance than the winter lake beyond the windows, but what she saw in them was not irritation. It was recognition. Gideon stared at her as though a locked door somewhere in memory had suddenly opened. Across the ballroom, Rosamund was watching. So was everyone else. Eliza prepared herself for the question she expected from a man who had never been introduced to her. Who are you? It never came. Gideon's expression shifted by the smallest degree, something guarded giving way to something almost impossible to name. Then, in a voice quiet enough that no one should have heard and somehow powerful enough to silence those nearest them, the most feared man in the ballroom spoke 2 words. Eliza Bellamy. Her breath caught. She had never met him. She was certain of it. But Gideon Harrow had said her name as though he had been waiting years to say it. For one suspended moment, Eliza could hear nothing but the orchestra and the faint crackle of candles along the walls. Gideon Harrow had spoken her name without hesitation, without asking anyone for it, and the certainty in his voice unsettled her more deeply than contempt would have. "Your Grace?" she managed. "I do not believe we have been introduced." Gideon's gaze remained on her face. "No," he said. "We have not." Behind them, conversation returned in cautious fragments, but the laughter did not. Eliza sensed Rosamond watching from across the ballroom. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, questions gathered faster than she could contain them. "Then how do you know who I am?" A pause followed. Gideon looked toward the dancers as though deciding whether the answer belonged in such a room. "That is not a conversation for tonight." Eliza's pride stiffened. "You will forgive me, Your Grace, but when a stranger knows my name, I find myself interested in the explanation." Something almost like approval passed through his expression. "You sound like your father." Her composure nearly broke. "You knew my father?" Gideon did not answer immediately. His hand tightened once against the chair before becoming still again. "I knew enough of him to remember his daughter." Before Eliza could press further, Lady Rosamond approached with Florence beside her. Rosamond's smile had returned, but there was strain beneath its polished surface. "Your Grace, I hope Miss Bellamy has not disturbed your evening." "We were only amusing ourselves." Gideon turned his eyes toward her. "At Miss Bellamy's expense?" Rosamond's smile faltered. "It was merely a harmless game." "Harmless things rarely require someone else to be humiliated." His voice never rose. It did not need to. Florence suddenly found great interest in the floor. Rosamond opened her fan. "I fear you misunderstand." "I rarely misunderstand deliberate cruelty." Silence gathered around them again. Eliza felt no pleasure in Rosamond's discomfort. She wanted only to escape the attention before curiosity became gossip. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I believe 10 minutes have become quite enough." Gideon looked at her. 10 minutes? Eliza regretted the words immediately. Rosamond answered first. "It was part of the game." Gideon's expression hardened by a degree. "I see." Eliza rose. "Good evening, Your Grace." She had taken only one step when his voice stopped her. "Miss Bellamy." She turned. Gideon was standing. That alone changed the room. Several nearby conversations ceased. He was taller than she had realized, his black evening coat severe against the candlelit gold surrounding him. "You asked how I knew your name," he said. "I cannot give you the entire answer here. But I can tell you this. Your presence beside me is not an embarrassment." Rosamond's fan became motionless. Eliza held Gideon's gaze. "I did not believe it was." This time, unmistakably, something warmed in his eyes. "Good." He inclined his head and walked away, leaving Eliza with more questions than before. Mrs. Agnes Bellamy found her several minutes later near the tall windows overlooking the dark lake. "Eliza, what happened?" her aunt whispered. "Half the room is talking about you and Blackmere." Eliza watched Gideon disappear through the doors leading toward the west gallery. "I wish I knew." Across the ballroom, Rosamond had gathered Florence and 2 other women close. Their expressions were no longer amused. They were worried. Eliza noticed it, and for the first time she wondered whether the cruel game had exposed something its creators had never intended to uncover. At the far end of Wycliffe Hall, Gideon entered the shadowed gallery alone. He stopped beneath an old landscape painting and reached beneath his coat. His fingers closed around a silver pocket watch he had carried for 12 years. He did not open it. He did not need to. He could still remember the initials engraved inside its case. E.B. Gideon closed his eyes briefly. He remembered rain against black water, a man's exhausted voice, and a promise made when he had been young enough to believe promises could wait indefinitely to be fulfilled. Then he looked back through the open doors toward the ballroom. Eliza stood beneath the chandeliers, unaware that the man everyone feared had recognized her before she ever reached his chair. Unaware, too, that he had known exactly who she was from the moment she entered the room. 12 years earlier, Gideon Harrow had learned that a promise could remain silent without ever becoming forgotten. Standing alone in the west gallery of Wycliffe Hall, he held the silver pocket watch inside his closed hand while music drifted through the open doors behind him. He had not expected memory to return with such precision. Rain striking the surface of Blackmere Lake. A lantern trembling in the darkness. The smell of wet wool and cedar. And Samuel Bellamy, younger then, speaking with the quiet urgency of a man who believed certain words mattered enough to survive him. Gideon opened his eyes. He had been 26 that autumn, proud enough to mistake independence for invulnerability, and restless enough to cross the lake when every sensible man had already returned home before the weather turned. The storm had arrived faster than anyone expected. By midnight, Gideon had found shelter at Bellamy Orchard House, soaked through and ashamed of his own recklessness. Samuel Bellamy had asked for nothing in return for helping him. That was what Gideon remembered most clearly. No favor. No introduction. No promise of influence. Samuel had simply placed dry clothes near the hearth, poured coffee, and treated a future duke as though he were merely a tired young man in need of warmth. Before Gideon departed the following morning, Samuel had pressed the silver watch into his hand. "Return it some day," he had said. "When circumstances are kinder." Gideon had intended to do exactly that. Then life had intervened with the efficiency it often reserved for unfinished promises. His father died. The Blackmere estates became Gideon's responsibility. Years passed beneath ledgers, obligations, funerals, and expectations. When he finally asked after Samuel Bellamy, he learned that Bellamy was dead and the family fortune nearly gone. By then, the watch had become less an object than an accusation. Gideon turned it over now, feeling the familiar engraving beneath his thumb. He had remembered Samuel's daughter as a child mentioned only briefly, a little girl who loved the orchard and refused to come indoors before sunset. He had expected, if they ever met, to find someone diminished by what had happened to the Bellamy name. Instead, Eliza had crossed the ballroom while people laughed at her and sat beside the man they had chosen as the instrument of her embarrassment. She had trembled. Gideon had noticed that. But she had sat anyway. Courage, he had learned, was rarely the absence of fear. More often, it was dignity refusing to surrender to it. "Your Grace?" Tobias Crane's voice came softly from the gallery entrance. Gideon turned. His long-time steward had accompanied him to Wycliffe Hall, and now stood with the discreet patience of someone accustomed to waiting for answers. "The carriage can be brought around whenever you wish." "Not yet." Tobias glanced toward the ballroom. "Miss Bellamy?" Gideon's eyes narrowed. "You noticed." Everyone noticed. Gideon slipped the watch back beneath his coat. "Find out who currently holds the liens against Bellamy Orchard House." Tobias hesitated. "You believe there is something irregular?" "I believe Samuel Bellamy was many things. Careless was not one of them." From the ballroom came another swell of music. Gideon looked through the doorway and found Eliza almost immediately. She stood beside Agnes Bellamy near the windows, listening while her aunt spoke. Candlelight touched the chestnut in her hair. She looked composed again, but Gideon saw the way her fingers tightened around her folded fan whenever Rosamund Vale glanced in her direction. Then Eliza looked up. Their eyes met across nearly 40 feet of polished floor. Gideon did not look away. Neither did she. For several seconds the ballroom seemed to recede between them, leaving only an unanswered question passing silently from her expression to his. "How do you know me?" Gideon could have crossed the room. He could have returned the watch that very night, and explained everything he knew. But everything he knew was not enough. Samuel's final letter remained locked at Blackmere House, and there were sentences in it Gideon had never been able to reconcile with the official account of the Bellamy collapse. A property transfer completed too quickly. A debt that appeared where none should have existed. One family name repeated twice. Vale. Gideon's attention shifted toward Rosamund. She was no longer laughing. She was watching Eliza with something colder than amusement now. Unease. Gideon understood then that the evening had changed. The women who had meant to make Eliza insignificant had accidentally placed her beside the one man in the room who remembered her father. And somewhere beneath 12 years of silence, an old promise had begun demanding to be kept. The orchestra had just finished a quadrille when Gideon returned to the ballroom, and Eliza knew at once that something in him had changed. He moved through the crowd without hurry, yet conversation softened as he passed, as though his silence possessed more authority than another man's command. Eliza remained beside her and near the windows, determined not to watch him approach. She failed. "He is coming this way," Agnes whispered. "I can see that. Should we leave?" Eliza almost smiled. "If we flee now, Aunt Agnes, everyone will assume we have committed a crime. At present, I am less concerned with everyone than with the Duke of Blackmere." Gideon stopped before them. He bowed first to Agnes. "Mrs. Bellamy." Agnes looked startled that he knew her name as well. "Your Grace." Then his attention settled on Eliza. "Miss Bellamy." She lifted her chin. "Have you decided that tonight is suitable for explanations after all?" Agnes drew a quiet breath, but Gideon merely regarded Eliza with that same unreadable calm. "Not entirely." "How reassuring." A faint change touched the corner of his mouth. "You are displeased with me. You know my name, you knew my father, and you refuse to tell me why the fact matters. Displeased seems reasonable." Before Gideon could answer, the musicians began tuning for the next waltz. Around them, couples moved toward the center of the room. Eliza expected him to excuse himself. Instead, Gideon extended one gloved hand. "Dance with me." The words were quiet. Their effect was not. Agnes stared at him. Several women nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Across the ballroom, Rosamund Vale lowered her fan. Eliza looked at Gideon's offered hand. "Is this another answer you intend to postpone?" "No." "Then why?" His eyes held hers. "Because you have spent enough of this evening standing where other people placed you." Something tightened unexpectedly in Eliza's chest. She placed her hand in his. Gideon led her toward the floor. The whispers began before they had taken 5 steps. He ignored them. Eliza tried to do the same. When the waltz began, Gideon's movements were precise and restrained, his attention fixed entirely upon her. He did not hold her too closely. He did not attempt charm. Somehow that made the moment more unsettling. "Everyone is staring," Eliza murmured. "They were staring before. For a different reason." "Then let them discover a better one." They turned beneath the chandeliers. Candlelight swept across Gideon's face and vanished again. Eliza became aware of Rosamund near the edge of the floor, perfectly still. "You have not danced publicly in years," Eliza said. Gideon raised an eyebrow. "You have been asking questions. I live in a small community. Questions are unnecessary. Information arrives by breakfast." That almost drew a smile from him. Almost. They completed another turn. "How do you know my name?" Eliza asked again. Gideon's expression changed. The ballroom seemed suddenly farther away. "Because someone once asked me never to forget it." Her steps nearly faltered. Gideon steadied the rhythm without drawing attention to her surprise. "My father?" He said nothing. "It was my father." "Yes." Eliza searched his face. "What did he ask of you?" Gideon's gaze moved briefly toward the dark windows. "Something I should have answered years ago." "That is not an explanation." "No." "Then give me one." For the first time, the feared Duke of Blackmere looked uncertain. It lasted only a heartbeat, but Eliza saw it. "Your father helped me when I was young," he said. "At a time when he had no reason to do so. Before we parted, he gave me something that belonged to your family." Eliza's breath caught. "What?" The music began to slow. Gideon guided her through the final turn. "A silver pocket watch." Eliza stopped when the waltz ended. Around them, couples bowed and curtsied, but she scarcely noticed. My grandfather's watch disappeared 12 years ago. It did not disappear. Gideon's voice softened. I have it. The revelation struck more deeply than she expected. That watch had been one of the mysteries surrounding the final years of her father's life. Why would he give it to you? Gideon looked down at her, and something old and burdened passed through his eyes. That is the part one cannot explain here. Eliza withdrew her hand. You keep saying that. Because there are things you deserve to hear without a ballroom listening. Before she could answer, Lady Rosamond appeared beside them, smiling too brightly. What an extraordinary surprise, Your Grace. I had no idea you and Miss Bellamy shared a history. Gideon's gaze cooled instantly. Neither did she. Rosamond's smile weakened. Eliza saw it then. Not jealousy. Not embarrassment. Fear. Small, carefully hidden, but unmistakable. Gideon saw it too. And when Rosamond turned away, his eyes followed her with sudden attention. Eliza felt the evening shift beneath her once more. The mystery was no longer simply why Gideon Harrow remembered her name. It was why hearing about her father's past had made Rosamond Vale afraid. By midnight the last carriage lanterns were disappearing along the winding road from Wycliffe Hall, but Gideon Harrow carried the evening home with him. Blackmere House stood nearly 8 miles away on a dark ridge above the lake, its stone walls silver beneath the winter moon. Most of the household had retired when Gideon entered, yet Tobias Crane was waiting beside the library fire. You asked me to look into Bellamy Orchard House, Tobias said. Tomorrow, Gideon replied. Tonight I need something else. He crossed the library, removed a small brass key from his watch chain, and unlocked the lowest drawer of his writing desk. Inside rested a narrow walnut box that had not been opened in years. Gideon carried it to the fire. The silver pocket watch lay exactly where he remembered, its surface dulled by time. Beneath it rested a folded letter, yellowed along the edges and sealed long ago with dark green wax. Tobias recognized the handwriting. Samuel Bellamy. Yes. Gideon unfolded the letter carefully. He had read it enough times to remember entire sentences, yet tonight one passage seemed different because Samuel Bellamy's daughter was no longer merely a name written in fading ink. She was a woman in a midnight blue dress who had crossed the hostel ballroom without lowering her head. Gideon read silently. Samuel had written of debts appearing against property that had already been paid for, of boundaries altered in county records, and of pressure to surrender the northern acres of the Bellamy orchard. He had feared that challenging the transactions publicly would destroy what remained of his family's standing. Then came the sentence Gideon had never forgotten. If circumstances turn against me, remember Eliza. She will pretend she needs nothing. Do not mistake her pride for proof that she has not been wronged. Gideon lowered the page. I should have investigated this years ago. Tobias did not offer false comfort. You did not know the extent of it. I knew enough to ask questions. Gideon returned his attention to the letter. Near the bottom appeared the name that had troubled him for years. Vale. Samuel had not accused anyone directly. He had simply written that several disputed transactions had passed through financial agents connected to the Vale family. Until tonight, it had been a thread without tension. Then Rosamond Vale had heard about Samuel Bellamy, and looked afraid. Find the original county property records, Gideon said. Not copies. I want the filings from the year before Samuel died through the following 3 years. Tobias nodded. And the liens? Every one of them. Gideon folded the letter. Quietly. Tobias left, and the library became still. Across the lake, miles away, Eliza sat at the small kitchen table of Bellamy Orchard House with a single oil lamp burning between herself and Agnes. The grandeur of Wycliffe Hall seemed impossible here. Wind moved through the bare apple trees outside, brushing their branches against one another with a dry winter whisper. A silver watch, Agnes repeated. Your father's? Grandfather's. Eliza wrapped both hands around a cup of cooling tea. Duke Harrow says father gave it to him 12 years ago. Agnes became very still. Eliza noticed. You knew. Not exactly. And Agnes? Agnes looked toward the dark window. Your father became secretive during his final years. There were letters, meetings, arguments about property boundaries. Whenever I asked, he said he was protecting you from matters you could not change. Eliza felt an old frustration return. Everyone was always protecting me by refusing to tell me anything. Samuel believed silence was kindness. Silence left us with questions and 40 acres of an orchard that once covered nearly 300. Agnes reached across the table. Eliza, there is something else. Shortly before your father died, a representative of the Vale family came here twice. Eliza's fingers tightened around the cup. Who? I never learned his name. But after the second visit, your father burned papers in the fireplace and told me that if anyone asked, I was to say the northern acreage had been surrendered voluntarily. Rosamund's frightened expression returned to Eliza with startling clarity. Suddenly the ballroom, Gideon's recognition, and the old watch no longer seemed like separate mysteries. They were pieces of the same unfinished story. Outside, wind crossed the abandoned greenhouse and rattled one loose pane of glass. Eliza rose and walked to the window. Far beyond the sleeping orchard, across several miles of black water, a faint cluster of lights marked Blackmere House. Somewhere inside that distant mansion, Gideon Harrow possessed something her father had deliberately placed in his hands. A watch. A promise. Perhaps more. Eliza stared at those lights until her tea went cold behind her. For 12 years, she had believed poverty was the ending her father had left her. For the first time, she wondered whether it had been something else entirely. A warning. Morning came pale and cold over Bellamy Orchard House, turning the frozen grass silver and revealing every neglected branch in the old orchard. Eliza had been awake since before sunrise. She stood inside the abandoned greenhouse with her sleeves carefully turned back, tying a strip of cloth around a loose wooden frame when Agnes appeared at the doorway. There is a carriage coming up the road. Eliza did not look up. At this hour? Black carriage. 2 horses. That made her hand stop. A minute later, wheels sounded over the hardened drive. Eliza stepped outside just as Gideon Harrow descended from the carriage. In daylight, without chandeliers or a ballroom surrounding him, he seemed less like the terrifying figure society had invented and more like a man who had spent too many years teaching himself not to reveal what he felt. His gaze moved from Eliza to the weathered house, then across the rows of apple trees stretching toward the lake. Your Grace? She said. Miss Bellamy. People usually send a note before visiting. I considered it. And? I suspected you might tell me not to come. Eliza almost smiled despite herself. That was perceptive. Gideon held out the silver pocket watch. For several seconds she simply stared at it. Then she accepted it carefully. The metal was cold against her glove. Her thumb found the familiar engraving on the back. I remember Father carrying this when I was little. Her voice softened. He used to let me wind it on Sundays. Gideon watched her without interruption. Why did he give it to you? Because I owed him more than I could repay that night. You said he helped you. He did. Gideon glanced toward the lake. I was caught by severe weather while crossing from the western shore. Your father gave me shelter here. He treated me with a kindness I had done nothing to earn. Eliza looked toward the house, imagining her father opening the same door 12 years earlier. And the watch? He asked me to return it when circumstances were kinder. A sad smile touched her face. Father always believed circumstances eventually became kinder. Was he wrong? Eliza looked across the orchard. 40 acres remained where nearly 300 had once belonged to the Bellamy family. The greenhouse roof needed repair. Paint had faded from the porch. You can decide. Gideon's expression tightened. I have begun looking into the property records. She turned sharply. Without asking me? Yes. Why? Because your father's letter gave me reason to believe the loss of this property may not have happened as you were told. Eliza became still. You have a letter from him? Gideon hesitated. Yes. And you did not bring it? Not yet. The softness vanished from her face. Then perhaps you should have sent the note after all. She turned toward the greenhouse. Gideon followed several steps behind. Inside, winter sunlight passed through dusty panes and fell across empty planting tables. Miss Bellamy. Eliza faced him. For 12 years, other people have decided what I should know. My father did it. My relatives did it. Now you arrive with his watch and another secret, and somehow I am expected to be grateful because you have decided to investigate my life. Gideon absorbed the words without defense. You are right. The answer disarmed her. I beg your pardon? I said you are right. He looked around the neglected greenhouse. I mistook action for permission. Eliza studied him. The feared Duke of Blackmere had apologized without ceremony, and somehow that carried more weight than elaborate regret. What do you intend to do? She asked. Find the truth. And afterward? If property was taken improperly, restore what can be restored. Her expression changed immediately. No. No! I will not become your charity. This is not charity. It will look like charity. Does appearance matter more than justice? To someone who has lived beneath other people's pity, sometimes it does. Gideon stepped closer, though a respectful distance remained between them. Then tell me what you want. Eliza looked at the broken panes above them, at the wooden tables her father had built, at the orchard beyond the glass. The truth. Nothing purchased for me. Nothing quietly arranged because a duke feels responsible for an old promise. Gideon regarded her for a long moment. He had come expecting resistance. He had not expected to admire it. Very well, he said. The truth. Eliza held out the watch. Then take this until you bring me the letter. Gideon looked at her hand. It belongs to you. So does the truth. He accepted the watch. Their gloved fingers touched only briefly, but both became still. Eliza withdrew her hand first. Gideon placed the watch inside his coat. As he left the greenhouse, he looked back once. Eliza had already returned to the damaged frame, repairing with her own hands what years of loss had failed to make her abandon. And Gideon understood something he had not understood in the ballroom. He did not want to rescue Eliza Bellamy. He wanted to stand beside her when she reclaimed what had always been hers. 3 weeks passed before Eliza saw Gideon again, and by then winter had begun to loosen its hold on the lake. The invitation arrived on heavy cream paper from the Mercer family, announcing an evening reception at their lakeside estate nearly 12 miles north of Bellamy, Orchard House. Eliza would have refused immediately if Agnes had not read the guest list twice and quietly said, "The valets will be there." Eliza understood. Since Gideon's visit, rumors had traveled faster than thawing water. Some claimed the Duke of Blackmere intended to purchase Bellamy Orchard House. Others whispered that Eliza had deliberately attracted his attention to rescue her family from poverty. None of it was true, which had never prevented gossip from becoming fashionable. So Eliza went. Mercer House glowed against the dark shoreline, its tall windows bright with candlelight, and its entrance crowded with carriages. Inside, spring flowers filled silver bowls, musicians played beneath a painted ceiling, and nearly every face Eliza recognized turned toward her before pretending not to. She wore the same midnight blue gown. Agnes had suggested borrowing another. Eliza refused. She had survived one room in that dress. She could survive another. Gideon stood near the library doors speaking with Tobias when she entered. His gaze found her immediately. He did not approach. Eliza was grateful. Tonight she needed the room to see that she could stand without him beside her. Rosamund Vale understood that too. For almost an hour, nothing happened. Then, shortly before supper, Rosamund moved toward the center of the drawing room carrying a folded sheet of paper. "Miss Bellamy," she called pleasantly, "perhaps you can settle a small question." Eliza turned. The conversations around her softened. "What question?" Rosamund unfolded the paper. "Whether this handwriting belongs to your father." Agnes went pale. Gideon's expression changed across the room. Eliza walked forward slowly. Where did you get that? Among old family documents. Rosamond smiled. It appears Samuel Bellamy wrote to powerful men when his affairs became difficult. She read several carefully selected lines aloud, phrases about protecting Eliza, preserving the orchard, and asking that his daughter not be forgotten. Removed from everything surrounding them, the words sounded like desperation. Rosamond lowered the page. It seems your family's relationship with Blackmere was less mysterious than everyone imagined. Your father asked for help, and now his daughter has finally collected it. A murmur passed through the room. Eliza felt every eye turn toward Gideon, then back to her. Rosamond continued softly. There is no shame in needing assistance, of course. Although one might wish to be honest about it. Gideon took one step forward. Eliza looked at him. Please! He stopped. The room noticed that too. Eliza faced Rosamond alone. Her heart beat hard enough to make the silence feel fragile, but her voice remained steady. You are correct about one thing. There is no shame in needing help. Rosamond's smile returned. How gracious of you to admit it. I am not finished. Eliza removed her gloves slowly and placed them on the table beside her. My family lost almost everything. I have worn repaired dresses. I have counted every dollar before winter. I have watched people who once accepted my father's hospitality cross streets to avoid acknowledging me. None of those things made me ashamed. Rosamond's smile faded. Miss Bellamy, there is no need for dramatics. Then why did you bring my father's private letter into a crowded room? Silence. Eliza stepped closer to the table, not to Rosamond. If my father asked someone to protect me, that tells you something about his fear. It tells you nothing about my character. And if Duke Harrow chooses to investigate what happened to Bellamy property, the truth will decide whether anything is owed. Not his title. Not your opinion. Not mine. Someone near the fireplace lowered her eyes. Eliza continued, quieter now. Poverty is not dishonor. Being helped is not dishonor. Working with your own hands is not dishonor. But using another person's hardship as entertainment, and calling it good breeding, comes dangerously close. Rosamond's face lost its color. For the first time, no one laughed. Gideon remained near the library doors, watching Eliza with an expression she could not read. She had asked him not to intervene, and he had obeyed. That mattered more than she expected. Then Rosamond lifted the letter again. A moving speech. Unfortunately, dignity does not change records. No, Gideon said from across the room. His voice was calm, but every conversation ended. Records change records. Tobias stepped beside him carrying a leather portfolio. Gideon took it and walked forward, stopping not in front of Eliza, but beside her. Miss Bellamy asked me for truth rather than charity. He placed the portfolio on the table. Rosamond stared at it. Gideon did not open it yet. Tonight, he said. She is going to have it. Eliza looked at him, and Rosamond's confidence finally disappeared. Whatever she had expected to happen at Mercer House, it was not this. And as Gideon's hand rested upon the closed portfolio, Eliza understood that the room had reached the edge of a secret her father had carried for 12 years. Gideon opened the leather portfolio, and the quiet that followed seemed to press against every window in Mercer House. He removed 3 documents, and placed them side by side beneath the candlelight. Rosamond stared at them without moving. Eliza recognized none of the papers, but she recognized the Bellamy name written across the first in faded ink. These are certified copies of county property records, Gideon said. The originals remain with the clerk. Lord Calvin Vale, who had been standing near the fireplace, stepped forward. Surely this is not the proper place for a discussion of private financial matters. Gideon looked at him. Your sister made them public. Calvin stopped. Gideon touched the first document. 14 years ago, Samuel Bellamy owned 287 acres surrounding Bellamy Orchard House. There were modest operating debts, all properly recorded. Nothing sufficient to threaten the estate. He moved to the second paper. 11 months later, a new lien appeared against 80 acres of the northern orchard. Eliza felt Agnes take her hand. Gideon's voice remained measured. The lien claimed that Samuel Bellamy had secured a loan against the property. Yet the bank listed on this filing had ceased operating 5 months before the date of the supposed agreement. A murmur traveled through the room. Rosamond recovered enough to speak. Old records contain errors. They do, Gideon said. Which is why Mr. Crane found the transfer that followed. Tobias handed him another sheet. The 80 acres were sold after the false debt was declared unpaid. The purchaser was an investment partnership registered through an agent in Albany. Gideon looked toward Calvin. That partnership was controlled by the Vale family. Rosamond's fan slipped closed in her hand. That proves nothing improper. By itself, no. Gideon placed another document on the table. This does. The room seemed to contract around the paper. Samuel Bellamy's signature on the lien does not match his signature on tax records, deeds, or correspondence from the same year. 2 county clerks have now confirmed the discrepancy. Calvin's face hardened. Are you accusing my father? I am stating what the records establish. The remaining questions belong to attorneys and the county court, not a drawing room. Gideon turned toward Eliza. But one fact no longer requires speculation. Your father did not voluntarily surrender that acreage. Eliza looked down at the documents. For years she had remembered Samuel Bellamy apologizing for failing his family. She had believed his final silence was shame. Now the past shifted beneath her feet. He knew, she whispered. Gideon reached inside his coat and removed the letter. Yes. He handed it to her. Eliza recognized her father's handwriting immediately. She read slowly, barely aware of the people surrounding her, until she reached the line Gideon had carried for 12 years. Remember Eliza. She will pretend she needs nothing. Do not mistake her pride for proof that she has not been wrong. Her vision blurred, but she refused to let the tears fall. Agnes squeezed her hand. Rosamond spoke from across the table. So we are expected to believe the Bellamys were innocent because a dead man wrote a convenient letter? Eliza folded the page carefully. Before Gideon could answer, an older gentleman near the mantel murmured, Eliza Bellamy. He said the name with surprise, as though seeing her for the first time. Gideon turned. Say her name again. The gentleman stiffened. No anger entered Gideon's voice. That made the command carry farther. Miss Eliza Bellamy. The man corrected quietly. Gideon looked around the room. And remember it correctly this time. His gaze moved over the same faces that had watched Eliza enter beneath whispers. Miss Bellamy requires no title from me, no fortune from me, and certainly no permission from this room to possess dignity. She arrived with it. Eliza looked at him. Gideon did not touch her. He did not claim her triumph. He simply stood beside her, exactly as he had promised without ever speaking the promise aloud. Rosamond's cheeks had gone pale. You are making me responsible for matters that happened when I was a girl. Eliza answered before Gideon could. No. Rosamond looked at her. I do not hold you responsible for documents created by others. I hold you responsible for what you chose tonight. The words landed without cruelty. That was why they carried such weight. Rosamond lowered her eyes. Eliza gathered her gloves from the table and took her father's letter. Around her, the room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the silence that follows recognition. 3 weeks earlier, those same people had watched her cross a ballroom because they expected her humiliation to entertain them. Tonight they watched her walk toward the doors with Agnes beside her, and no one laughed. Gideon remained behind only long enough to close the portfolio. Then he followed. Outside, the air was cold and clean, carrying the first faint promise of spring from the dark lake. Eliza stopped beneath the carriage lamps and turned toward him. You kept your word. Gideon met her eyes. Not yet. She held her father's letter against her coat. What remains? His expression softened. Whatever you decide comes next. Spring arrived slowly at Bellamy Orchard House. First came the softening earth beneath the apple trees, then green buds along branches Eliza had feared might never bloom again. By May, white blossoms covered the orchard, and the abandoned greenhouse no longer looked abandoned. Several panes had been replaced, not by Gideon's money, but with income from the first legal settlement returned to the Bellamy estate after the county court reviewed the disputed records. More claims remained unresolved, yet Eliza had discovered that justice did not need to arrive all at once to feel real. Sometimes it returned acre by acre, document by document, until a family could finally recognize its own history again. She kept her father's letter in the drawer beside her bed. The silver pocket watch rested beside it. Gideon had returned the watch without ceremony after the evening at Mercer House, saying only, "This time, it should remain where Samuel intended." During the weeks that followed, Gideon visited occasionally. Never without sending word. Eliza noticed that immediately. Sometimes he brought information from the attorneys. Sometimes he walked through the orchard with Agnes and listened to her stories about Samuel. Sometimes he came with no papers at all. Those were the visits Eliza found herself remembering longest. Gideon never offered to repair the house, purchase new equipment, or solve difficulties she had not asked him to solve. Instead, he asked questions. What did she want planted in the northern field if it was restored? Would she reopen the greenhouse commercially? Which varieties of apples had survived the hardest winters? It was a strange thing to be listened to after years of being pitted. Stranger still to discover how quietly affection could grow when no one tried to name it too soon. One warm afternoon in late May, Eliza crossed the lake by carriage road to Blackmere House. Gideon had invited Agnes as well, but her aunt had developed a suspicious headache immediately after reading the invitation. Eliza had pretended to believe her. Blackmere looked different beneath spring sunlight. The dark stone remained severe, but open windows softened its solemnity, and flowering vines had begun climbing the southern terrace. Tobias met Eliza at the entrance. "His Grace is in the greenhouse." Eliza smiled. "Of course he is." She found Gideon beneath a high glass roof overlooking the lake. The Blackmere greenhouse had been closed for years, but its doors now stood open to the warm air. Young roses climbed newly repaired frames, and rows of herbs filled long wooden tables. Gideon sat near the windows with correspondence beside him. There was an empty chair at his right. He rose when Eliza entered. "Miss Bellamy." "Your Grace." His eyes moved toward the chair, then back to her. Something almost amused passed between them. "I assure you," he said, "no one has arranged your seating." Eliza approached slowly. "That is reassuring. And no one is watching. Even better." She stopped beside the empty chair. Months earlier, another empty chair had waited beside him beneath chandeliers while an entire ballroom anticipated her embarrassment. She remembered the laughter, the heat in her face, the stubborn decision to sit rather than flee. She remembered Gideon turning toward her and speaking her name, as though it already mattered. Now there was only sunlight, the faint fragrance of roses, and the lake shining beyond the glass. Gideon did not pull out the chair for her. He did not ask her to take it. He waited. Eliza smiled and sat. Gideon slowly returned to his own chair. "The last time you sat beside me," he said, "people were laughing. I remember. I wanted to silence them. You eventually did." Gideon shook his head. "No. You did that yourself. I merely brought paperwork." Eliza laughed, and the sound startled a smile from him. It transformed his face so completely that she wondered how society had managed to fear a man capable of looking so unexpectedly human. Silence settled between them, but it was comfortable now. Gideon looked toward the lake. "I spent years believing solitude was simpler." "Was it?" "Much." Eliza waited. "And?" He turned toward her. "I no longer think simpler means better." There was no grand declaration in his voice. No demand. Only truth offered without conditions. Eliza placed her hand on the wooden table between them. After a moment, Gideon placed his beside it, close but not touching. You once asked what I wanted, she said. I remember. I wanted the truth. And now? Eliza looked at the open greenhouse doors, at the spring sunlight, then at the man who had learned to stand beside her without standing in front of her. She moved her hand the final inch until her fingers rested gently over his. Now I want to choose what comes after it. Gideon's hand turned beneath hers, holding it with quiet care. Outside, wind moved across Blackmere Lake toward the Bellamy orchard on the opposite shore, carrying the scent of new blossoms over water that had once separated two lives. Eliza had entered his world because others meant to make her small. Gideon had spoken her name because a promise had taught him never to forget it. But what grew between them belonged neither to cruelty nor obligation. It belonged to choice. And sometimes the place chosen for our humiliation becomes the very place where someone finally sees us clearly, while the heart we thought needed rescuing discovers that love, at its gentlest, does not save our dignity. It simply recognizes that it was there all along.